Hey everyone, this is Mark Treichel with another episode of With Flying Colors. This is an emergency episode due to President Donald Trump firing NCUA board members, Todd Harper and Tonya Otsuka. That happened 2 days ago. I'm recording this on the 17th. I'll get it up as soon as I'm done. And 2 days ago, they were fired by email, which you will see here in the PowerPoint. I've never done a PowerPoint slide in this fashion, so hopefully this records right. You're either looking at that or you're looking at my face, or neither of those worked, and I'm putting it just out as a podcast. So if you're listening via the podcast, the PowerPoint slides will be on YouTube. Email me if you'd like a copy of them. You should be able to follow along just through the train of thought that I put these together on, and we're off and running. So the topics I want to walk through is the fact that Harper and Otsuka were fired and what that means. I want to walk through what Chairman Kyle Hauptman can act on, in my opinion. I'm going to walk through NCUA's downsizing efforts, and I'm going to walk through some things relative to agency consolidation, that's banking agency consolidation and taxation. So what happened? The White House sent out a statement, and its statement says the White House has defended the firings, with Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt stating that President Trump is the chief executive of the executive branch and reserves the right to fire anyone he wants. This move follows a similar action in March when Trump removed Democratic commissioners at the Federal Trade Commission. That's from the right. That's from the actor, Donald Trump. Senator Warren stated the ranking member of the Senate Banking Committee from the left criticized the action as the latest attempt by Trump to skirt the rule of law, undermine independent agencies, and illegally purge the government of those who work for the American people. So, can President Trump fire a board member prior to a term end? By the way, Robert Swan sued President Clinton long ago about whether or not Clinton could fire Robert Swan, but Robert Swan's term had already ended, and it was concluded that he could. In this instance, there were terms left for Otsuka and for Harper. There is a Supreme Court decision that may apply. People are saying it applies. You be the judge. And the reality is, I'm getting texts about some things going on at NCUA as we speak. All right, that's from outside the NCUA, some things that some people outside our NCUA are hearing. I've got people that tell me stuff. I hear stuff from people who work for me who have contacts at NCUA. I conclude things based on my intuition, having been at NCUA for 34 years and run NCUA for 8 of those years. In any event, I digress. Can the president fire prior to the term end? There is a Supreme Court case out there that indicates that he may not be able to, and here's what some of what that says. Humphrey's Executor versus the United States, 1935. This unanimous Supreme Court decision held that the president could not remove a Federal Trade Commission member simply for political differences. The court distinguished between executive officers and quasi-legislative or quasi-judicial officers, ruling that the latter could only be removed with procedures consistent with statutory conditions enacted by Congress. So, was this for political reasons? You can argue yes. I don't know what the termination said. They probably didn't say that. They probably said for performance or something, or they were silent. But that we don't know what they said. We don't know if the facts apply to this. You can argue that they may. You can argue that they do. I'm not here to take that position. And of course, everybody has the right, if their due process is not followed, to sue. I've not heard from anybody who was fired, meaning Harper or Otsuka, but I've heard some people say they think they will sue, and time will tell. So this is some things that I think are relevant if you're looking at what has happened here recently at NCUA, and I call this slide a timeline of truth, rumor, and intuition. So there are things here I know to be true. There are things here I've heard from rumor, firsthand, secondhand, thirdhand, and there's things based on my intuition. Again, I ran NCUA for 8 years. I worked in the Office of the Executive Director for 11 and a half years, longer than anybody ever in the history of NCUA. I understand what's required of the board, what's required of staff, how the act works, etc. So there's things I can fill in holes. I can hear 3 or 4 pieces of information and that helps me conclude 4, 5, and 6. And that's what I'm doing here. Some of these, again, are truth. Some of them are rumor, substantiated potentially, and some of it's my intuition. So February 20th, 2025, the NCUA board agenda comes out, and it indicates that they are going to vote to select a vice chairman. That vice chairman was going to be Todd Harper, a Democrat. It's my understanding that on February something or other, sometime between the 20th and the 26th, Hauptman was told not to designate Harper as vice chair. What else was said in that conversation or communication? I don't know, but I have it from pretty good sources that did happen. February 26th, the vice chairman item disappears from the NCUA agenda. It may or may not have disappeared in violation of the Sunshine Act because it just came off their website. There was no notification sent out publicly about it being canceled. The paperwork may have been in process. And I guess if the president calls and says, do it, you do it and you clean up and you ask for forgiveness later. But I do not believe they followed the Sunshine Act in pulling that off. But regardless, March 3rd, during GAC, Hauptman changes NCUA's position on NSF and overdraft collection. And he does it at GAC. NCUA board members typically like to make a big reveal at GAC. His reveal was billion-dollar credit unions would not have to report overdrafts individually. They would collect it and they would talk about it in generalities, but credit union A that has overdrafts of this amount would not be out in the public eye. Otsuka and Harper had voted to require that previously. March 11th, Harper and Ostuka both issue separate statements against what Hauptman did, talking about what's wrong with transparency and other things, saying that this information should be out there. Banks are required of it. Why are we hiding from this information? March 12th, there's a closed meeting and it falls from the sky saying we did not have time. There was no opportunity for earlier public notice. And that was relative to the NCUA's agency downsizing plan. They didn't call it that in the paperwork. They called it personnel, and that's how you exempt something to be on a closed meeting item. By the way, back when I was at NCUA, you typically would have three types of board actions: an open item, a closed item, or a notation vote item. A notation vote item could be either something that would have been open or closed, but is more routine nature where the board automatically agrees and you would do some of those things via notation vote. But something could be, one board member could say, I don't want this to be done by notation vote and drag something to a board meeting. You could have a vote of 2-1 on a notation vote and they could agree to vote no on it and then just move forward and not have to do it on the recorded record of the agency. And that's recently, the board members have been doing that. It's quicker, it's faster, it's less work, it's a lot of things. But they have not been doing a closed board meeting. I haven't had a chance to go back and look when the last time they actually did one was, but they do most things by notation vote. So out of the sky falls we're going to vote on this plan. I understand they had a very long meeting. I understand they did not vote on it, and their plan was due to OPM the next day, March 13th. It's my understanding they did not submit a plan. I believe that it's very possible that board member Hauptman tried to go get this through on notation vote, and one of the other board members or both said, no, we're going to meet on this. That may not have happened, but since they've had 0 closed board meetings in several years, I believe that to be true. All right, so they didn't submit the plan by March 13th. March 21st, there was a follow-up closed meeting on the downsizing plan, OPM restructure, plan required by President Trump, whatever you want to call it. And there was a vote to approve it. It could have been a 3-0 vote. It could have been a 2-1 vote. Board member Todd Harper always tries to reach consensus in anything he does, and I believe he probably did vote for it. I don't know what Otsuka did, but if there was a 2-1 vote, I would bet that Otsuka was the one who voted it down. Again, intuition. April 10th, NCUA announces an April agenda where they are going to do a briefing on the disaster rule to help California because of the fires that happened there, and a briefing on the downsizing plan. Again, they call it something else, but it's a plan to downsize. And they announced on April 10th with the 7-day notice that they would do that. That would have been last Thursday. April 10th, on or about, I hear rumors that Doge has arrived at NCUA. April 10th or about, I hear rumors that the Doge is upset with and is displeased about the lack of people in the building, implying that they are violating Trump's desire to have efforts to return to work. Now, I understand and believe that NCUA negotiated things with their union that did not need to be negotiated about working from home, but they did do that. And I believe NCUA said we're complying with our contract. So whatever they did, they either renegotiated, they had some level of requirement to come in. I think they learned from the pandemic that working from home can work, but that they were bringing people back. But allegedly, Doge wasn't happy with how this all was working out. April 15, Harper and Otsuka fired via email. I say via email because I saw a press story indicating that's what Otsuka indicated. April 16th, there's a lot of chatter coming out of the agency and with people I know that are outside the agency that Harper and Otsuka are fired, essentially. Not necessarily with those words, but implying that they're about to be or were. And the rumors that NCUA will be canceling their board meeting. And then late in the day on the 16th, the board meeting was canceled. Did Hauptman cancel that because he didn't want to do the briefing solo? Or was he told by the White House to cancel that board meeting? I don't know. What can Hauptman act on? As a primer, the Federal Credit Union Act says that the board can only act with a quorum. They can't act without a quorum. And a majority of the board shall constitute a quorum. You can find support that says a quorum of a board is 2 and is never 1. And you can argue that if there's only 1 board member, that a quorum is a 1-0 vote. You decide, or the courts can decide. However, there's some history here. And oh, by the way, on April 16th, America's Credit Unions, the trade association, came out and said, under the Federal Credit Union Act, without at least 2 members on the board, the NCUA is unable to implement any new action, but the agency can still perform its supervisory and examination duties. So they're viewing that act as saying you need a quorum, and a quorum is not 1. In my opinion, I think that's their interpretation here. Let's look at history, though. In 2000, I was the deputy executive director for a board that was Damore, Wheat, and Dollar. 2001, Bassino came in on recess, and it was Bassino and Dollar and Wheat at one juncture. And then it was just Dollar for 2 months, January of 02 and February of 02. In March of 02, Joanne Johnson and Debbie Matz were both confirmed and became board members with Dollar on the same day. So there were 2 board meetings where there was only 1 board member. I remember at the time, based on discussions on the 7th floor with Skiles and Bob Fenner, that there was a legal opinion that Fenner had put together, the late great Bob Fenner, and that it concluded that a board of 1 cannot act, as that does not constitute a quorum. It may also have said you could argue that if it is a quorum, that you could act if something was urgent, but that if board members are coming quickly, what would be the point of proposing a rule and then having that rule finalized and having someone challenge it on a technicality of 1 board member not being able to act? And my recollection is that was the first of many of the NCUSIF insurance fund briefings. Chairman Dollar did a briefing on the insurance fund in one of those board meetings and a briefing on something else, because the board member can be briefed in public at a minimum if there's no vote. By the end of that year, there was a change to NCUA's delegations, which said that the granting authority to carry out any essential function of the NCUA board when there's only 1 board member currently serving on the board. That was put in place in 2002, and it was revised in May of 05. Now, what trumps what? No pun intended. The Federal Credit Union Act overrides the delegation approved by the NCUA board. So if you believe that the Federal Credit Union Act says a quorum is required and you believe that a quorum is more than 1, that would be one decision. If you believe that a board of 1 could act under what this delegation is saying on something that's essential, And both could be true theoretically, maybe. You could argue that there are things that Hauptman can do if it's defined as essential, and going back to America's credit unions definition or position, they would view the exam as essential, as would I. So what is the definition of essential? Essential is absolutely necessary or extremely important. That's not NCUA's definition. It's not the Federal Credit Unions Act definition. It is what I found when I Googled the definition. Okay. So are regulations essential? Maybe. Is the budget essential? You need to have a budget because you need to collect the dollars. However, NCUA, when they approve their budget, they have a 2-year budget. And so they have a budget. You could argue that is not essential. Live with the other budget. And Hauptman could control spending of the dollars by saying what he wants done or doesn't want done, or his other delegations that give him power. So they don't necessarily need a budget. And I would argue they don't have to have one. He can control the agency in that way. What about appeals? Those are rare. Would that be essential? Maybe. What about conservatorships where NCUA removes the board and serves as the board? Maybe. It's my opinion that whatever Hauptman decides to do, credit unions in general will be okay with it because it's going to be deregulatory. To quote one of his priorities, which I think is consistent with a lot of things he said, NCUA should be mindful that the only people who think compliance is easy are those who don't have to do it. So whatever he does is not going to make things harder on credit unions. Therefore, I don't think credit unions will sue regarding it. Doesn't mean somebody else wouldn't. Okay, on to downsizing and the impact on NCUA. When you have staffing problems, exams become the only important thing. Excuse me while I wet my whistle, if you will. Exams become of paramount. An exam of code 5 comes before a code 4, becomes before a code 3, comes before a 2, comes before a code 1. But exams are already slow. NCUA changed their policies, allowing to elongate billion-dollar-plus credit unions, in part to give some regulatory relief, but also in part to try to comply with their own policies. Hauptman 2 years ago made a point saying we can't do our own exams on time. And I hear from credit unions saying, you're giving me my old exam the same 2 days before you come in for the new exam. And I've had conversations where I can confirm that has happened. So exams are already slow. They changed policies to help, partially with the purpose of helping. And now they're offering buyouts and triggering retirements anywhere from 12 to 18, 20% of staff. I believe their goal, from what I've heard, is to get to below 1,000. They're losing executive level staff, they're losing supervisory examiner staff, and they're losing material amounts of specialists. They're losing a lot of corporate knowledge. So what happens when exams come first? Things that come second would be mergers. Things that come third would be bank acquisitions. Oh, by the way, if their delegations of authority apply and you are bigger, the transaction is of more than $500 million, that requires the NCUA board to act. Can the NCUA board act? Would that acquisition be considered essential? All things to think about. Field of memberships, those are housed separately. So to the point that there were staffing changes in the Office of Cure, field of membership could get slowed down, but not any more so as being reprioritized over exams unless they take field of membership people and have them start doing exams. And appeals, what will happen on the chain of appeals? Typically, they use their clock on those anyway, and they have timelines they have to reply on. But again, can a board of one act on appeal? Is that appeal essential? NCUA staffing, their 2025 budget was for 1,247 staff or full-time equivalents, FTEs. They have apparently a document, I haven't seen it, I've heard it referred to, but a document that goes out in the name of transparency to NCUA staff. I have heard that 172 have accepted offers. That's about 13.7%. I have heard that the agency is trying to get below 1,000 because that's a good soundbite to say, hey, NCUA is complying, we should be kept separate. I have heard that one region may have 0 associate regional directors left, and I have heard that they may be losing half of their SEs. I heard that second or third hand, not directly from NCUA. So if there's anybody at NCUA saying, why is somebody talking to Mark? I didn't hear all this stuff from somebody at NCUA. I have people out there that are good sources that give me information. And sometimes I do hear things from NCUA, and sometimes, again, it's intuition. I tend to put things in here if I heard them from somebody else because I don't want to get anybody in trouble if they're telling me things. And generally, that's how I handle these things. All right. Regulatory consolidation. Where are we at relative to regulatory consolidation? The head of the banking committee, Tim Scott, said they were looking at potentially merging the regulators. Treasury Secretary Bessent said he's not interested in merging the agencies. And then later he came out recently saying he'd rather control by FSOC and by having more definitions around the definition of safety and soundness. That's all good. NCUA has a seat at the table at FSOC. Hopefully what Bessent is saying is what plays out. But with all the shenanigans or the actions, whatever you want to call them, getting down to one board member, could trigger people thinking that this might be something that they want to do. And even though those folks didn't mention NCUA, you have to believe it's just because of an oversight that NCUA is at the kids' table sometimes in these conversations that they would be swept into organizations. It's possible all the banks would be one and NCUA would be kept separate, but it's also possible this never happens because it would take an act of Congress. So there's things that Trump can do where he appoints one person to be in charge of 2 agencies. In my mind, if there is consolidation, it's going to be in this constructive consolidation where maybe Rodney Hood, who used to be at NCUA, who is at the OCC, maybe Rodney Hood will be in charge of OCC and NCUA. How would that happen? Hauptman's term is up in August. Hauptman could leave. Hauptman could get fired because the White House is upset with him wanting to make Harper vice chair. Who knows? Hauptman could go work at another agency to do something. They could reassign him over there. A lot of things could happen. If there's consolidation, I don't think they have the votes from the R's and the D's. I think it would be more of one of these, we'll have more than one person running other organizations. And if that's the case, hopefully that would be Hood because he understands NCUA. He's been there twice. And I believe he believes in credit unions. So that if there's going to be somebody other than an NCUA board member running NCUA, I would hope that it would be Rodney Hood. And Republicans raise this every time they come in the White House. For the 40 years I've been involved with credit unions, every time there's a Republican in the White House, they talk about the possibility of consolidation. Taxation, I'm not going to go into great detail here, but could that be on the table? Sure, it could. But that, again, would take a vote in Congress. And can they get that? The problem is they talk about the 2 things you don't want to see made are law and sausage because they're both ugly. That could be done in the middle of the night. Hopefully that doesn't happen, and credit unions lobbying efforts and Americans telling Congress individually when they hike the hill how important credit unions are to them will keep that at bay. Here's a recent release from Rodney Hood where he said he was going to combine the mid-size and community bank supervision and large bank supervision programs into one. So he's consolidating things. FDIC is consolidating things. You could argue that maybe NCUA would say, hey, we don't need the Office of National Exam and Supervision. It used to be in the region. Let's collapse that. We have 20% vacancies. We need to do triage. I'm sure there's discussions on how they're going to get things done. However, to get rid of the Office of National Exam and Supervision, that would take a board vote. The establishment of the Office of National Exam and Supervision is in a regulation, and there are regulations that tie to that. So Hauptman would have to do that on his own, or there would have to be somebody appointed by Trump to come in, and they'd have to put in 1R and 1D, and then they would have to take those actions. So stay tuned on what might happen there. As far as examinations and supervisions, I believe if ultimately there were consolidations that all other things being equal, every agency is downsizing, but you look at the current staff footprint, the data shows that the same size bank gets 1.35 hours of examination time per year compared to 1 hour of credit union time. Said another way, $1 billion credit union compared to a billion-dollar bank, that bank will have 35% more exam hours charged on it. Again, that's all things being equal, with the footprints different. But ultimately, you get out 5, 10, 15 years. If there was a consolidation of all the banking regulators, I believe that credit unions would have more of an exam present. There would be bank-centric examination matrix applied, as I'm saying, and that there would be a loss of credit union-specific regulatory approach. I believe the insurance funds would be merged. I believe credit unions would likely ultimately be subject to CRA. And by the way, credit unions count their insurance fund, 1% of it on their assets, and as a result, they have 1% more requirement on risk-based capital and prompt corrective action. So if they collapsed all those, that 1% would be written off, and then they would be required to have 1% less capital because that is built into the ratios. All right, here's my contact information. Here's my team. You can reach me at marktreichel.com. Please listen to the podcast. Follow us on With Flying Colors. If you like this, give us a 5-star review. I also have a second podcast called Credit Union Regulatory Guidance Podcast, which is AI versions of guidance from NCUA, OCC, FDIC, CFPB, hosted by Samantha Shares as in share deposits. And again, that is AI. It's like an audio book of guidance, although I'm not expecting a lot of guidance these days. So I've been issuing recently some things that OCC put out that is really stellar. There's my LinkedIn contact, there's my email address, and this is my team of folks that help me with my credit union clients. That's it from here. I'm going to click stop sharing, and we're going to come back here. I appreciate you listening. I'll try and get this out today. Got a client call coming up. I got another league call tomorrow, at least one next week. If you are listening and you're from a league, or you would like your league to have me present this to you, feel free to reach out. All right. Have a great day. Thank you for listening. Hope you listen again soon. Mark Treichel signing off with Flying Colors.